Back at it again with the Mobius Dickus, chapter 41, Moby Dick. That's right. It only took 41 chapters to get to the title of the novel. So this is an interesting chapter. There's a good amount of content here, and we're kind of exploring similar questions that we started to discuss in chapter 36 and the trilogy of chapters that followed. So first I want to talk about this passage, a little bit into the chapter, where it says, "Nor did wild rumors of all sorts fail to exaggerate and still the more horrify the true histories of these deadly encounters." For this is, of course, Deadly Encounters with Moby Dick. For not only do fabulous rumors naturally grow out of the very body of all surprising terrible events, as the smitten tree gives birth to its fungi, but in maritime life, far more than in that of terra firma, wild rumors abound, wherever there is any adequate reality for them to cling to. And as the sea surpasses the land in this matter, so the whale fishery surpasses every other sort of maritime life, in the wonderfulness and fearfulness of the rumors which sometimes circulate there. For not only are whalemen as a body unexempt from that ignorance and superstitiousness hereditary to all sailors, but of all sailors they are by all odds the most directly brought into contact with whatever is appallingly astonishing in the sea. Face to face they not only eye its greatest marvels, but hand to jaw give battle to them. Alone in such remotest waters that though you sailed 1,000 miles and passed 1,000 shores, you would not come to any chiseled hearthstone, or aught hospitable beneath that part of the sun, in such latitudes and longitudes pursuing to such a calling as he does, the whaleman is wrapped by influences, all tending to make his fancy, his imagination, pregnant with many a mighty birth. So I think this is an interesting passage which seems to imply perhaps not madness, but certainly some divorce from reality is a result of contact with the divine. It seems to ask the question, are there realms of knowledge that humans are not meant to explore? Is there a set of questions which would be too much for human beings to try to answer? And the passage seems to imply that those whale fishermen who go after sperm whales are doing the same type of, in this case, physical, but perhaps, if we were to look at it figuratively, exploration of the depths, which could lead someone to be open to their fancy taking hold of them, to being taken hold of by certain forces that are not particularly based in truth, which might even be a kind of madness. Of course, that makes us think of Ahab. Additionally, we have the exploration of the pasteboard mask idea from chapter 36, continued in this chapter, where this paragraph says, "Nor was it his unwonted magnitude," of course, speaking of Moby Dick, "nor his remarkable hue, his whiteness, nor yet his deformed lower jaw, that so much invested the whale with natural terror." So even though Moby Dick is big and white and has a weird jaw, what imbues him with terror is that unexampled intelligent malignity, which according to specific accounts he had over and over again evinced in his assaults. More than all, his treacherous retreats struck more of dismay than perhaps aught else. So what are these treacherous retreats? Well, sometimes when swimming before his exulting pursuers, with every apparent symptom of alarm, he had several times been known to turn around suddenly and bearing down upon them, either stave their boats to splinters or drive them back in consternation to their ship. So that action of almost falsely running away and then turning back to fight shows a level of intentionality which is, rather disturbing in a whale. So we're back to the pasteboard mask question of Ahab. Is the world full of inscrutable malice? Is the world full of some divine force, be it God or whale instinct, either way, that is like self-aware and interacting with human self-awareness? Or is the meanness and violence of Moby Dick simply the empty mechanicalism of animal instinct? Or does Moby Dick know what it's doing? Or is Moby Dick a symbol of God's wrath? Is there more meaning there, or is it an empty whale? This paragraph seems to indicate it acts in a manner consistent with Ahab's notion that there's something behind that mask of magnitude, of hue, of jaw, physical characteristics. There's something intelligent beyond those physical characteristics. Same thing here. Judge then to what pitches of inflamed, distracted fury the minds of his more desperate hunters were impelled when amid the chips of chewed boats and the sinking limbs of torn comrades, they swam out of the white curds of the whale's direful wrath into the serene, exasperating sunlight that smiled on as if at a birth or a bridal. Now, obviously, one needs to contrast the vision of the sun smiling at birth or bridal as an image of the sun being empty and mechanical compared to Moby Dick, who in the previous paragraph seems to adapt to the situation and have intentionality behind it. The sun continues to smile on, regardless of whether the scene is positive or negative. So I think what the sailors are so upset at is perhaps either the fact that the sun does not seem to care that they are not as happy as at a birth or bridal, or they are upset at the fact that Moby Dick does not seem as mindless and mechanical as the sun. I think you could interpret it either way. Now we get to this paragraph, which ultimately I think summarizes Moby Dick and its figurative importance for Ahab, right? I think Ahab has already clearly stated why he is upset with Moby Dick in chapter 36, but here we have, if you weren't paying attention in chapter 36, Melville is just going to give it directly to you again. The white whale swam before him as the monomaniac incarnation of all those malicious agencies which some deep men feel eating in them till they are left living on with half a heart and half a lung. That intangible malignity which has been from the beginning, to whose dominion even the modern Christians ascribe one half of the worlds, which the ancient Ophites of the East reverenced in their statue devil. Ahab did not fall down and worship it like them, but deliriously transferring its idea to the abhorred white whale, he pitted himself all mutilated against it. All that maddens and torments, all that stirs up the lees of things, all truth with malice in it, all that cracks the sinews and cakes the brain, all the subtle demonisms of life and thought, all evil to crazy Ahab, were visibly personified and made practically assailable in Moby Dick. He piled upon the white whale's hump the sum of all the general rage and hate felt by his whole race from Adam down, and then, as if his chest had been a mortar, he burst his hot heart's shell upon it. I mean, wow, what writing there. So there's a couple things I want to pay close attention to here. The first is the repeated phrase, or not the repeated phrase, but repeated idea of intangible malignity and malicious agencies. Those are both, of course, referring to that notion that there might be something intentional about the way the world works, that perhaps the things that happen to people are the result of a god punishing them, or the result of a competing willpower that is as equivalent in its stature and intellect to your own, as opposed to the lack of malice or malignity would be that empty mechanical interpretation of nature. I like this reference that the modern Christians ascribe one half of the worlds to that intangible malignity. I assume that's a reference to Satan being the ruler of hell and a Paradise Lost-esque kind of framing. I also like that the repetition of the word all is used to help drive home the notion that Moby Dick is a collective grouping of ideas. I like the reference here that I should have highlighted this in yellow if I was being more precise, that part of what is tough about Moby Dick is not just the possibility of him representing life thwarting the human will, but that it also he also comes to represent ambiguity insofar as he cracks the sinews and cakes the brain, right? He makes the brain covered up and difficult to see clearly. And then ultimately, I love this phrase, all the rage and hate felt by his whole race from Adam down. So I think Melville was really cluing people in to say, look, guys, I'm talking about a human problem. This is not just an Ahab problem. Like, yes, Ahab does worry about these questions, like, is there inscrutable malice behind the pasteboard mask? Is life and what happens to you the product of intention or the product of fate? And how do you tell? These are questions that any human needs an answer to and has an answer to. Their answers might not be justified. Their answers might be bad. But this is a question that can generate rage and hate in all human beings from Adam down. What makes Ahab special is this question has become so overwhelming for him that he has burst his heart and has become obsessed and cannot push this question aside like most people can. In fact, the last passage I'd like to look at is a really well-written passage, I think, talking about how what separates Ahab from other people's engagement with the constant question of whether life is dictated by a deterministic mechanical universe or whether there are larger forces or competing decision makers that decide what happened, is here when it says human madness is oftentimes a cunning and most feline thing. When you think it fled, it may have but become transfigured into some still subtler form. Ahab's full lunacy subsided not, but deepeningly contracted, like the unabated Hudson when that noble Northman flows narrowly but unfathomably through the Highland Gorge. So presumably that's a metaphor with the Hudson River at some point getting very thin, but it's still got the same value of water running through it. And in fact, if it's getting thinner and it has the same volume, then the pressure and speed is higher. But as in his narrow-flowing monomania, not one jot of Ahab's broad madness had been left behind. So in that broad madness, not one jot of his great natural intellect had perished. That before living agent now became the living instrument. If such a furious trope may stand, his special lunacy stormed his general sanity and carried it and turned all its concentrated cannon upon its own mad mark. So that far from having lost his strength, Ahab to that one end did now possess 1,000-fold more potency than ever he had sanely brought to bear upon any one reasonable object. So Ahab's obsession with this question about fate and free will and choice and control and knowledge means that as he becomes more obsessed, he becomes actually stronger and more persuasive as a person because his obsession just channels his energies so focusedly that he doesn't waste his time on any other stuff, which I think is often like the difference between being obsessed with something and working really hard at it is often very thin. And most of the people you know who are like really, really good at something or working to become really, really good at something often flirt with this, you know, the thin distinction between monomania and working really hard and focus. And I found that willingness of the passage to acknowledge how Ahab is not crazy. He's just channeled all his energy into something, which is a form of insanity, it seems, but does not diminish his intelligence. Pretty interesting. Okay, that's chapter 41, which is a good one and continues some very interesting themes that we discussed in chapter 36. Chapter 42, the head honcho, the big one, coming up next, and I'll see you there.